Welcome back. In this video, we want to talk about the difference between for loops and while loops. Without further ado, let's dive in. But before we get started, if you haven't seen my videos about for loops and my videos about while loops, it's critical to watch these videos first before you watch this one. Because if you don't understand what for loops are and how to use them, and if you don't understand while loops, this video is not going to make sense to you. So go watch these other videos first and then come back here. All right, now let's talk about the difference between for loops and while loops. So to start, let's take a very simple for loop example and write the equivalent while loop for it. So a simple for loop example would be something like this. Let's say maybe for I in range 9. And then let's just print I for now. Print I. This is a for loop, very simple for loop, where you have a for loop that will execute 9 times. And in each iteration, you're just gonna print the value of I. Now, what is the equivalent while loop for this for loop? If you wanna write the same thing, if you wanna have the same logic using a while loop, it's gonna look like this. First, you have to initialize a value of a variable. Let's say I is equal to 0. And then we can say while I is less than 9, print I. And then we say I plus equal 1. Or I is equal to I plus 1. As you see here, this for loop is equivalent to this while loop. Meaning if you actually run the code over here, you're going to see these printed on the screen. You're going to see 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So 9 iterations. In each iteration, you print the value of I. If you instead run this program, the while loop program, you're going to get the same exact result. You're going to get the same exact result. So now what is the difference between this for loop and the while loop? When should we use a for loop and when should we use a while loop? There has to be a reason why we have 2 different types of loops in a programming language. So one quick simple observation here is your for loop is much shorter than your while loop. Basically, in your for statement, you needed just 2 lines of code. The equivalent statement, the equivalent while loop statement, you needed 4 lines of code. So this is the first difference that we can see from this simple example. What is the reason that the for loop is shorter than the while loop? Well, as you can see, the first thing in the for loop, you didn't need to initialize the value of I. So no need to initialize. The I is referred to as the loop counter or the loop variable. Let's call it the loop variable here. So there was no need to initialize the loop variable, meaning we didn't really need to assign a value to I like what we did here in the while loop. We started by saying I is equal to 0. And the reason for that is you can think of this range 9 as if it's conceptually, it's something like this, 0, 1, 2, until 8. And essentially when you come to this for loop, what happens is the loop variable I is going to be initialized with the first value in this list of values. So first I is going to be 0, and then in the next iteration it's going to be 1, the following iteration is going to be 2, and so on and so forth. And that is the reason why we don't need to initialize the value of I, because I, the loop variable in general, is going to take its values from whatever comes after the in keyword. On the other hand, if we look at the while loop, that is not the case. In a while loop, we said that this is going to be our condition. And in a while loop, any variable that is in your condition needs to be defined and initialized before the condition. Or otherwise, you're going to get an error because Python is not going to know about this variable. So in this case, all variables in the condition must be defined and initialized. So that's the first difference between a for loop and a while loop. And one reason why a for loop is generally shorter than a while loop that is doing the same thing. Another thing here that is worth noticing is in the for loop, I just needed to print I. I didn't need to tell Python that the loop variable should go ahead and take the next value from the list here, because this happened automatically. Once the loop body, which is just one statement here, once it ends, the loop variable, which is I, is gonna automatically go and take the next value in the list, which in this case is going to be 1. I didn't have to explicitly do anything here for this to happen. On the other hand, in the while loop, I had to explicitly say I plus equal 1, because a while loop is not going to do this on its own. A while loop doesn't have this notion of a loop counter or a loop variable. So everything you have to explicitly mention. In this case, what I want to do here is I want to increment I by 1 in order to be able to imitate what's happening in the for loop automatically. So here, number 2, the loop variable will be automatically updated. Here, all updates must be explicitly stated. And this is another difference between a for loop and a while loop. And again, another reason why a for loop is much shorter than a while loop that is doing the same thing. Well, if this is all the difference there is, then why do we even need a while loop in the first place? Why can't we just do everything with a for loop? And here's the answer. You can't really do everything with a for loop because a for loop assumes that you know beforehand how many times, how many iterations you need to execute. So in this example over here, this simple example, we know exactly that we need to execute this for loop 9 times. And that's why in a situation like this, using a for loop is actually much more appropriate to using a while loop, okay? But that is not always the case because there are many situations where you will not know the number of iterations that you need to execute before the loop starts. So in other words, you can think of a for loop as a special case of a while loop. A while loop is much more flexible than a for loop. You can represent any kind of loop using a while loop because a while loop just takes a condition that evaluates to either true or false. There's no notion of a loop variable. Nothing really happens magically. Nothing happens automatically. You are in full control over everything that happens in the logic. And this gives you flexibility to express some logic that you can't otherwise express using a for loop. So another main difference between a for loop and a while loop is that a for loop is used when the number of iterations are known beforehand. Whereas a while loop, the number of iterations is unknown. Again, that doesn't mean that you can't use a while loop when you know the number of iterations, because like I said, a while loop is very flexible and you can do anything with it. Actually, in this specific example, we were able to write a while loop that is doing exactly the same thing as a for loop. So a while loop can be used to express anything, but it's more appropriate to use a while loop when you don't know the number of iterations that you want to execute beforehand, or when your exit criteria from the loop is a condition, when you're trying to wait until some condition is met and then you exit the loop. Whereas in a for loop, you maybe want to execute your loop a specific number of times, or maybe you want to go through the characters of a string or some items in a list. But the major thing is you know beforehand how many times the loop is going to be executed. The loop body is going to be executed in a for loop, whereas in a while loop, you don't know beforehand how many times it's going to be executed. All right, and this is the difference between for loops and while loops. And like I said before, the for loop and while loop constructs are not just Python constructs. They are programming constructs that you're going to be using in any other programming language you might learn in the future. So the difference between for loops and while loops in Python is going to be exactly the same as the difference between for loops and while loops in any other programming language. So make sure you understand these concepts really well. Know when it's more appropriate to use while loops and when it's more appropriate to use for loops. And the more you practice, the more you're going to get better. And the more these things are going to come naturally to you. You're not even going to be thinking about it. As you code, as you write your code, you will just feel, okay, like I should be using a while loop here. I should be using a for loop there. It will just come to you. You just need to keep practicing and keep practicing. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.